when it comes to, well, technology, industrial relations, workplaces, etc. I can kind of see a few people's pictures, and you know, some people are working from home and some from the office, and all of these things weren't actually available to us last time there was a pandemic, which I think, well, or a potential pandemic, and we sort of look back to SARS and swine flu as being times when not a lot changed, but this time the world changed. And unfortunately, there was already a whole lot of IR changes on the way before the pandemic hit. And although there has been some level of relief, the reality is that most of these things have actually continued to continue to occur. So, for example, these changes to the modern award, they were pushed back before the pandemic arose, and they just kind of snuck through to the keeper as the pandemic arose. So there's plenty happening, and I'm going to endeavour today to talk you through what I think, well, what's keeping us busy, but also particularly what I think is relevant to the civil contracting space. That said, we are going through a lot of varied and different information, and so if anyone does have any questions or wants to focus a little bit more on specific areas, please. I don't know how you stick your hand up on a Zoom session, or otherwise just send a message through to Mel. So what we're going to look at today is a few things. The first thing, I'm just going to look very broadly at the review of modern awards and just give some context to what's happening in the construction industry, and also just a couple of things or a couple of pointers in terms of your employees who are not covered by the construction award, because most people will be covered by an award. And one of the changes that's come up is a change to the miscellaneous award, which means that a lot more people are award covered than used to be covered. And what that means then moving forward, and there's certain decisions which you would have heard about and probably received some information about in terms of things like the annualised wages and so on. I'm then going to look in more detail at the recent changes to the construction award, just to explain and provide some context there. And look, there is some good news. It's not all bad news, which I suppose is a good thing, but certainly there are things to look out for. I'm then going to just talk briefly about a few other things that are keeping us busy from a general client perspective. That's the workpack litigation, which is the litigation in relation to whether someone's a casual or not, and how you can look to protect your business in that space. I'm going to look briefly at JobKeeper. It's a bit of crystal ball gazing, but just to talk through some of the elements of that. I want to talk briefly about redundancy. It's an unfortunate element of the current environment, but at the moment we've had an explosion of unfair dismissal cases, of which the vast majority are employees who are being laid off in the context of redundancy. And then finally, just look at the construction industry long service leave fund, because we've been assisting the CCF in what's effectively a pitched battle with the construction industry long service leave board, who has adopted a fairly expansionist stance in terms of who is covered, and particularly encroaching in the civil space. So just to talk you through what those issues are, to make sure that you're somewhat forearmed in terms of any contact that you might have with the long service leave board, because unfortunately quite a few members of CCF have been, I'll use the phrase duped, but I guess in the long run a court will decide whether they were properly required to be in the fund or not. But certainly the position that was taken by the long service leave board over a period of time isn't consistent with our view as to how that legislation ought to operate in the civil space. So we've got a fairly full agenda. As I say, I'm new to Zoom seminars. I tried to set this up with Mel the other day and completely crashed my docking station. Spent the next 4 hours on tech support calls, but that's okay. It seems to be working. But like I say, if anyone has any questions or so on, please message me and I'll try to keep an eye on that box just to make sure. Okay, so moving along to the review of modern awards. Just a bit of background. This review of modern awards was meant to be a 4-yearly review of modern awards. It was sort of meant to be every 4 years we'll have a look at a modern award, make sure it's working, make sure that there's no other changes required, and just make sure it's up to date. Well, the first review started in 2014 and is still going, and it's been going so long and been so resource intensive for the people who are involved in it that all parties agreed to the legislation being changed to get rid of these 4 yearly reviews of modern awards. And the unfortunate reality of that is that I suspect, as a matter of practice, Commission itself is exhausted by this modern award process. It's involved a whole series of test cases, but then each individual award has its own, what they call award stage, and each award then has its own individual cases, and I say cases because it's not just a single case. And I think it's about, if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, there's 13 current cases just for the on-site construction award, and they're not the ones that have been already resolved. So there's probably 20 or 25 pieces of litigation affecting that award alone, and there's 120 odd modern awards. So without being a maths expert, it's probably about 1,500 cases running over 6 years in terms of reviewing modern awards. So review fatigue will set in, no doubt, or has set in. There's no doubt about that. And I suspect the result of that is that we don't anticipate seeing significant overhauls of modern awards once this process has been completed, and certainly not this idea of a 4 yearly review to make sure that's up to date and up to speed. And that, having said that, as recently as yesterday, a full bench of the Commission has indicated, at least in the healthcare sectors, that they will be revisiting this question of pandemic or paid pandemic leave. And it's likely, given that the full bench is driving that ship, it's likely that paid pandemic leave will be brought into those healthcare awards. And once it's in a healthcare award, it's typical that other unions would seek to bring that into their industry, and no doubt the construction unions will seek to bring it into the construction awards. So having said that, we don't expect to see any changes. It's a dynamic world we live in, and particularly so given these unprecedented circumstances surrounding the coronavirus pandemic and the response to the pandemic more relevantly. So I just want to touch on a few major changes to modern awards. It's not the intention today to go into all of the changes. As I said, there's 1,000+ cases, each of which might lead to 1 or 10 or who knows how many variations to individual awards. But there are a few just to be mindful of. Again, not necessarily affecting the construction industry, but certainly affecting some awards that are in the construction industry. So for example, the Clerks Private Sector Award is affected by a couple of these decisions, and almost all, if not all, members are likely to have at least one employee covered by the Clerks Award. And then we start to talk about some other ones. Now there's a dot point that's not there, although if I'm very clever here, I might be able to actually do this real time and add, here we go, I can do that. Look how good this is. So the miscellaneous award has been changed, and it's important to understand how that miscellaneous award has been changed, because the problem that we've now got is a huge amount of uncertainty about award coverage in the construction industry. This is a particular bugbear of mine, because many years ago, when the modern award was being made, there was a particular sentence that got added right towards, particular sentence got added into the miscellaneous award, and that was something that was at my behest in a former life, working for an industry association. And that was a clause that said the miscellaneous award does not apply to any employee who is in an industry where there is an industry award and that award does not have a classification to cover that person. And the example that we gave was foreman. Now, if you pick up the on-site construction award, you will see that there is a definition of foreman, and it suggests that foremen are covered. When you dig a little bit deeper though, right towards the end of that classification structure, there is a clause that says that the definitions, the broadbanded classification definitions are taken from the previous awards. And if you recall 10 years ago when this award was made, the on-site, the National Building and Construction Industry Award, the AWU Construction and Maintenance, the Civil Award, SA Civil Contracting Industry Award, and the Metals On-Site Award were all mashed together to create one big building industry award across 3 awards that were already sufficiently detailed that their own identity, but alas, that's what happened in that space. Now, when you actually drill into it, a foreman is actually a foreman on a building site in New South Wales or Tasmania. So foremen are not actually, or were not covered by an award at all. And the effect of that, the effect of the clause in the miscellaneous award was they're a foreman, they're in the industry, there's no classification for them, there's no other award that provides occupational-based coverage as there is for, say, the clerical award, and therefore they were award free, and it was clearly award free, and that's, you know, foreman, site supervisor, etc. So that's the position as it was. That position has now changed, and basically the miscellaneous award now applies to anyone who is in an occupation that would typically be award covered. Now, what does that mean? We have got no idea. It was just a change that was made, but the strong likelihood is that those sort of classifications, foreman, you know, clearly it was award covered in some places, New South Wales and Tasmania as an example. And then you move up to that next step of site supervisor. And the question about whether a site supervisor would be covered is one that unfortunately we can't answer until there's litigation. And then moving up the chain, is a site manager covered? At that point, it's a managerial employee. You know, managerial employees are typically not award covered, but there is any amount of litigation about whether or not a person's award covered. What's the significance of award coverage? The significance of award coverage is really compounded when we start to look at this next dot point, being the annualised wages decision. Now, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about wages. This perhaps can be a subject matter of an entire seminar. So I'm hoping that I can say it succinctly and at least give everyone an understanding of exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the annualised wages decision. And so I'll start with the starting point. For anybody who is award covered, there are, with a couple of exceptions, mainly to do with professional employees, the award specifies a wage. And there is a difference between a wage and a salary. A wage is a weekly amount that is paid effectively by the hour, and on top of that you then pay per hour work. So you'll have overtimes, you'll have penalty rates and all those kind of things, and the award sets what the minimum wage is per hour. It then, and sometimes per week, but per hour, it then sets what the penalties are and the allowances and all the other bells and whistles that go into to making up someone's award entitlements. That's what most award, or how most awards are structured, and it's how most awards were structured prior to modern awards coming into effect. A salary is an agreement between the employee and the employer, a contractual agreement that basically says, I'm going to pay you this sum of money, and that's going to cover you for all of your entitlements. Now, for an award-free person, it's a pretty simple equation. You pay them the salary and you're done. For an award-covered person, you need to make sure that the salary that you pay them is sufficient to cover them for their entitlements under the award, or you know, in the case of an enterprise agreement, under the enterprise agreement. There's no problem doing that as long as it's in a properly drafted contract, and there's also no problem doing that as long as you pay them enough to cover their entitlements. But the difficulty with a wage is that you don't know what a person's entitlement under a wage is until they've worked their time. And that's because you don't pay overtime unless someone works overtime. So if someone works very normal hours and predictable hours, it's very easy to work out a salary. But if someone's hours are unpredictable, it's very hard to work out what that salary would be in advance. And so the difficulty that you then face is making sure that everyone, or these people are actually earning enough to cover them. For people with very big salaries, it doesn't matter. But the closer you get to that award minimum, the more likely it is that you'll end up with a latent underpayment just based on the pattern of work that a particular employee ends up working during the various exigencies that do arise. When the modern awards came into effect, they included an annualised salary provision. Some of them, not all of them, but certainly the Clerks Award had one, and a number of other awards that would be relevant to civil contractors had that ability. And that basically said, we agree on a salary, we review it once a year, we make sure like it's a fair thing, and away we go. We don't have to worry about all the record keeping, we don't have to worry about all these other issues. We just get, we agree on a salary, and as long as it's fair enough, that's all we need to do. The recent annualised wages decision has rebroken the nexus between the annual salary and the award. In other words, you can still agree on a salary with an employee, but you need to continue to make sure that whatever their pattern of work is, the salary is sufficient to cover their entitlements or what their entitlements would have been if they were paid under a wage. And so for all those awards that have an annualised salary provision, it's now called an annualised wage provision. And the annualised wage provision is so bureaucratic, it is so ridiculously bureaucratic, you wouldn't bother using it because it is everything that the common law arrangement does, plus a whole series of other paperwork burdens that in each case, if you fail to comply with them, you're exposed to a prosecution. So that's what's happened with annualised salaries. It means that anybody who you've got engaged on a salary, you need to be mindful that A, it needs to be properly expressed in a contract, and B, that you need to be meeting your award entitlements. Or the best description is that you've got enough meat on the bone in terms of what your actual salary is to cover them for the potential changes in potential work patterns that they may otherwise work in. And that, of course, is then compounded because of the change to the miscellaneous award, meaning that people who were not previously award covered now have that obligation arising. I haven't got a dot point about this, but this whole process forms part of a sort of almost like an unholy alliance of legislative changes that have ratcheted up the importance of this. But part of the importance of this is time and wage records. So in other words, you as an employer have an obligation to maintain time and wages records in circumstances where there is an underpinning industrial instrument that will provide for an overtime payment. And so for all these positions like receptionists and estimators and site managers and so on, it is likely as a result of these various changes that you need to keep time and wages records for them. And again, there are a lot of nuances about how you do keep time and wages records. It's not as simple as keeping a timesheet, but you need to look at that from a compliance perspective, because not only is that obligation now there, but part of this unholy alliance of various legislative provisions was that there is now what they call a reverse onus of proof. So if you are required to keep records and you don't keep records, then you have to disprove an employee's wage claim against you. So the employee can make all sorts of outlandish claims about the hours they worked, or in the current environment, I was working from home, I worked till midnight, I get a shift loading, I get overtime penalties, all these kind of things that an employee can claim. And you as the employer, if you haven't kept the records when you ought to have, then you can be found liable, or then you have to disprove their case, which is a very difficult thing to do if you don't have any evidence to support that. Okay, so that's the miscellaneous award. It's the annualised wages. The final, or the second last dot point I flag is plain language redrafting. The Commission has undertaken this exercise in a number of awards, and they've basically rewritten the award in a way that they think is clearer language. And I must admit, it is far, far less clear than it was before. And unfortunately, they've upset the apple cart in terms of a whole series of decisions that relied on, as lawyers always do, that argued about what the meaning of a word and a comma and everything else was. They've moved the word, moved the commas, changed the words, And so awards are quite different in the way they look. It's intended not to change them except where expressly made. But I'd be very careful about your previous understanding of any awards that apply to you. It is worth rereading awards simply because the language has changed in many of them. And one obvious example, which I flag, sorry, is that a hand going up or? Oh, sorry. One obvious example which I flag because most awards is annual leave. And for some reason, I keep getting this query. And when I say for some reason, it's a fairly obvious reason that employers, we've had this initial couple of months where everyone's tried to grapple with how to manage COVID. We're now moving into what seems like a more sustained holding pattern. And as a result of that, employers are looking at ways to manage their balance sheet, including their leave obligation balance sheet. And annual leave is obviously one of those key elements to it. Annual leave is an interesting beast. The question is generally asked, can I force a person to take annual leave? And this is something that is commonly misunderstood. The National Employment Standards contain a fairly strict and limited ability to force a person to take annual leave. The default position in the National Employment Standards is that an employee, that annual leave is taken by agreement between the employee and the employer, and the employer must not unreasonably refuse a request by an employee to take annual leave. That's the default position. The only change to the default position is that if an employee is covered by an award or an enterprise agreement, then that award or enterprise agreement can set rules for taking annual leave. For anyone who's award or enterprise agreement covered, that's the extent of the ability to force leave. So most awards will have a provision to the effect of allowing for an annual close down, but not all awards do. An award I was looking at the other day, the Architects Award, does not have the ability to have an annual close down, and it means the employer can't force an employee to take annual leave during an annual close down. And of course, I had paused to look at that because a client had asked that exact question because an employer was refusing to take it. The second part of it is excessive accrued leave. And this is one where obviously people are trying to manage their leave accruals. If the award doesn't allow for someone to take excessive accrued leave, then put simply, they can't force a person to take leave. They can, the employee can refuse to take that leave, and there's nothing that you can do. There was a test case as part of the review of modern awards that has included the abilities to cash out leave, excessive leave accruals, and Christmas close downs. And it's worth just having a quick look. I'll just put up on screen, I hope. If someone can nod their head to let me know they can actually see what I've just put up on the screen. But this is the Building and Construction On-Site or General On-Site Award. And when we're talking about someone who's got too much leave, it's defined as 8 weeks leave. And then it sets out this extraordinarily bureaucratic process that you must follow if you want to force an employee to take leave. And it says, without going through it in great detail, that the most you can make them take is about a quarter of their leave. So they've still got to keep a 6-week leave balance. And you've got to go through this rigmarole of, at least 8 weeks notice and not more than 12 months notice. And you've got to sit down with the employer and try and genuinely agree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this seems like it's stupid bureaucratic stuff. But the point is, if you don't follow this, if you don't follow these requirements, you can be prosecuted for breaching the award. And it's a significant piece of leverage that an employee would keep or keeps over the employer. So really important that these processes that most people think are fairly standard and have been normalised over a long period of time in industrial relations practices have been turned on their heads. Okay, so that's a very broad overview of the review of modern awards. I'm now going to turn to specifically the on-site construction award. This first slide doesn't necessarily deal with things that have changed, but I just want to flag what, in my experience in dealing with this award, are what I would describe as the nasties. These are the things that often trip people up. The first thing to look at is the method of engagement. The construction award has a very unique form of full-time employment called daily hire employment. Most civil contractors would be weekly hire, that is traditional full-time employment. However, the making of the modern award has seen or has integrated daily hire employment as an option for civil contractors. Now, the difference between daily hire employees and weekly hire employees is limited just to the notice of termination that's required. In other words, a daily hire employee is a full-time employee. They accrue annual leave and sick leave, and they take public holidays and all those other entitlements of full-time employees they receive. But instead of giving them notice of termination as per the national employment standards, which is that scale, if anyone's seen it, you know, in the first year it's a week's pay, and then in the second and third years it's 2 weeks, and then there's a bit extra if you're over 45 and so on. It's simply a day's notice that you can lay the person off, just giving them a day's notice. Now, of course, there is an extra payment the employee receives, a thing called the follow the job loading. But if you're already paying well above award rates, it's worth looking at whether or not you would engage your employees as daily hire to give you that extra flexibility in terms of labour requirements. The second thing that I'll just talk about in terms of the types of employment, because this is consistently, in my experience, this is regularly not complied with, is the obligation to employ or to advise casual employees in writing of their terms and conditions of engagement. And I'll just put up this clause in the award just for everyone's benefit. It's clause 14.3, and it's not just saying you're a casual. It says you must inform the employee in writing that the employee is to be employed as a casual, stating who the employer is, the job they're performing, the classification level, the actual or likely numbers of hours to be worked, and the relevant rate of pay. So failing to do that, failing to engage your casuals in writing, can lead to a prosecution. And I know that you think, well, that sounds a bit stupid, but from an industrial relations perspective, what happens is an employer is making a claim against you. They want back pay, they want money. It's always about money. And of course, they throw in this extra little breach that you've committed as a means of leveraging more money out of you. The next thing, the next nasty in this award is the industry-specific redundancy scheme. Most people don't believe you when you tell them what the definition of redundancy in this award is. They genuinely think you are lying. And so again, it's worth just quickly looking at the definition of redundancy for the purpose of this award. And it says redundancy means a situation where an employee ceases to be employed by an employer to whom this award applies, other than for reasons of misconduct or refusal of duty. Redundant has a corresponding meaning. What does that mean? It means when the employment ends for any reason other than misconduct or refusal of duty, that is a redundancy within the meaning of the award. That means a resignation is a redundancy. It means someone dying is a redundancy. It means someone abandoning their employment is still a redundancy. It is an awful definition, but it is the definition that applies under the award. You'll note that there is a slightly different scale of payments. So it maxes out after 4 years, and it's only payable for resignation and the like once you hit 12 months service. But just to be mindful, that provision exists and that applies to employers across the industry. And the only way to not have to pay that would be to look at making something like an enterprise agreement to deal with that. The next thing that's interesting about the construction award that is not present in most awards or many, if at all, other than perhaps electrical contracting and plumbing as being sort of adjunct awards to the industry, is the entitlement to get paid for turning up to work, the daily fares allowance. Now, I won't deal with that now because there's a separate slide on it. but just to be mindful that that's quite unique, and it's something that most people don't understand or realise exists. The award has very complicated wage calculations. It's got wage calculations that incorporate a series of allowances. And again, there's another slide on this because this is one of the things that was recently simplified, but something that people often get wrong, which is that when you look at the award, you pick up clause 19 of the award, you go to clause 19.1, and you see, oh, that's the minimum weekly or monthly wage, great. But then you actually go down to clause 19.3 and you'll see an hourly rate calculation. And the actual hourly rate that is payable to an employee is an amount that includes a whole series of other things. And you will see there's a different calculation between daily hire employees and a different calculation for weekly hire. And as I say, for most civil contractors, they would be weekly hire employees. And you can see that what gets added into those rates are things like in charge of plant allowance or underground allowance, both of which can be relevant in the civil space or regularly relevant in the civil space. And of course, other ones would be applicable to the various attendees. So that's something that again, just to flag. The other thing to flag is that the award contains what I would describe as extraordinarily rigid hours of work rules. Most awards allow you to do things like work more than 8 hours in a day without payment of overtime. Maybe it requires agreement, maybe it doesn't. To roster, instead of 38 hours over 1 week, it might be 76 hours over a fortnight, or up to 152 hours over 4 weeks. And I think the Black Coal Award goes up to whatever that number is multiplied by 26 weeks. So a lot of awards have a degree of inbuilt flexibility, but the construction award does not. It is extremely inflexible to the point where a written agreement is effectively required just to not work RDOs, just to not work on an RDO cycle, let alone to be able to do things like bank roster days off and the like. And again, we've got another slide about that, so we'll touch on that. And the final element of this award that is reasonably unique is payment for inclement weather. I don't have a slide on this. I just want to flag it as being one of those things that people often get wrong, and it's worth having a look at those provisions just to make sure that you are complying with them. Okay, so that's just a brief overview of why this award is at the upper end of the echelons in terms of the rigidities and the extra costs and hidden costs that are contained in them. Now let's just turn to what changes have recently occurred. And the biggest change that's occurred for anyone who had the pleasure of reading the award prior to this change, there was something like 80 different allowances that were payable. There was an allowance payable if you were using a power tool, or an allowance payable if you were using a pneumatic tool, and an allowance that was hot or wet or dirty, or all these various little allowances that would add up or apply. Look, the short answer was no one ever really followed them or understood them. And it was one of those things that usually the time that you found out about it was when you had particularly a union coming and making a claim against you and saying, well, you need to pay these people all this, you breached the award, pay money, pay back pay, and all those kind of things. So it was one of those award nasties that would sneak up and catch people. So the Fair Work Commission has made a decision to substantially rationalise those allowances. And so basically most of them have been deleted from the award, which is a good thing. But the trade-off for that is that they have increased the industry allowance. Now, if I go back to this calculation, you'll see the hourly rate is determined by adding the minimum wages and the industry allowances. And so what the effect of this decision has been is to essentially increase the base rate of pay as a means of compensating for the loss of all these other allowances. I suspect from a net cash position, it's probably more expensive for employers to do this, but from a compliance perspective, a much simpler process to follow. So some good and some bad as far as that goes. Again, I won't bore you with the calculation, but the key the key takeaway from this is that there is now a different award rate depending on whether the work is in the residential sector or not. So all work is not otherwise, that's not within the definition of residential, is at the higher rate, and it's a fairly limited definition of residential, which I'll pull up if you bear with me a moment. Or will I? No, I won't. It's not.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Sorry, I'll just go away. I've just had a look at the minimum award and the industry allowance, and looking at if I calculate that with our employees, then looking at the tables that you've got with the pre-made amounts, they don't add up to the same.
Are you talking about the CCF publication? Well, I'm not sure what table you're... Oh, you mean the table that I just showed just before?
Yeah, but they're you know how you're saying it's minimum wage plus their 6% industry allowance, and then I've seen where you look up tables for the construction industry, and they've got if you're in the civil sector or building in residential or non-residential.
Yep. So I'd need to know where that table is. I do know that the one that was published by the Fair Work Ombudsman was wrong for a while. And so
has that been changed recently?
Well, I haven't looked at it myself. My business partner, Dave Putland, is the calculation guru. I'm reliably informed by him that the calculation was incorrect, but it has now been updated. But I can't, as a doubting Thomas by name and by nature, I can't actually tell you that that's the case.
Okay, because when I looked at it, it said it was about 6.6% instead of just the 6% with just the industry loading. So maybe it's been updated. But I was just wondering
just for your benefit, CCF, or we on behalf of CCF publish rate sheets. So it might be worth just having a chat with Mel after the session and seeing if you can get a copy of that. It's on the website somewhere. I just don't know where it is.
I'll email it out with a link of the recording to this as well, just for everyone's benefit again.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. And just on that note, if anyone does want to ask a question, I know it's a bit thingy when you do it on the chat, but you're welcome just to call out like that. I'm happy to take calls. As I said, there's so much in this. We're just trying to get through as fast as we can, but please feel free to stick your hand up. The other thing just to note in this space is reimbursement for boots. This was not previously an award entitlement other than for refractory bricklayers, which was a pretty niche occupation. It is now clear in the award that the employer is required to reimburse an employee for boots, and I'll just find the exact clause just so you can see exactly what it says. It says where employees are required by the employer or by legislation to wear steel-toe capped safety boots, the employer will reimburse employees for the cost of purchasing such boots on commencement of work, and then subject to fair wear and tear, they'll be replaced every 6 months if required or sooner if agreed. So that's a new entitlement. It is something to be mindful of, because I know the existing practice has always been to, well, not always, but for most employers has been to typically wait, usually about 8 weeks to work out if someone's any good before you get put to the expense of uniform, etc. But it's pretty clear that that's required. And of course, where it says where you're required by the employer to wear steel-toe capped safety boots, I can't think of a circumstance on a construction site where that's no longer the norm, or where that's now, and where that's not the norm. So in those circumstances, it's more or less a universally applicable entitlement.
Tom, we've just had a question. Is the amount capped for reimbursing?
It's not capped. It's not. Which is unfortunate. And that's something that would need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And it might well be that you're better off just providing the boots or not. And can I just say, I'll get to this point later, and I might labour the point quite a bit. But there's a little question down the bottom. It says, can you pay above award to factor in allowances or whatever else? And the short answer is it is possible to do it, but it needs to have what they call a set-off clause. And I'll deal with set-off clauses later because that is front and centre in the WorkPack litigation. What is a set-off clause? And unfortunately, the High Court might completely turn all that on its head when we get to the High Court decision, whenever that may be. But there's a capacity to pay above award to deal with a lot of these things, but it's not as simple as just doing it. You need to have certain things in place, and it's obviously strongly recommended that those things be committed to writing so that you've got evidence to show exactly what you're doing. Okay, so that's next fares and travel, and this is what I would describe as the good news. It's not necessarily good news in the sense that you still have to pay it, but up until this decision came into effect, for employers in the civil construction sector and the general building sector, so both of those sectors, the rule was you had to pay daily fares and travel every day they turned up to work, and it didn't matter if they reported for duty at the yard or on site or wherever it was, you had to pay the daily fares. Now, just as a little bit of boring history for anyone who's an IR buff, the whole point of daily fares and travel allowance is not to compensate an employee to turn up to work. Every employee has to turn up to work. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. The argument was that I work on a building site, so I might be, over this side of town one day, and I might be over the other side of town the next day. So I don't have the ability to determine the most economical and cost-effective and time-effective way of getting to and from work. And so it's not daily fares and travel, it was excess daily fares and travel. And so there was a component which was the excess fares, and there was a component that was the excess travel time. And so the argument always was, well, if I'm turning up to the yard, if I'm reporting for duty to the yard, what's the difference between that and a factory and a shop or any other static workplace? But that wasn't the way the award actually operated. And I know when I ran a session like this about 12 months ago for civil contractors members, this was the slide we spent the most amount of time on. And I spent a lot of time trying to explain to everyone that you still have to pay it. The good news is that you can unexplain that. If people report for duty to your yard, in other words, that they start at the yard and they end at the yard, then you no longer have to pay the daily fares and travel under the award. For most people, you just weren't paying it anyway, so it's good news that you're not actually breaching the award or requiring to pay a substantial amount over the award to set it off. So that's the good news. There is a slight carve out, which is if someone's performing prefabrication work for a project that's not the employer's yard. So, sort of an example, if you're doing like precast elements, it's not your yard, but you're not quite on the building site, that would be an area where you would still pay daily fares. But if it's your yard, then you don't need to pay the daily fares, and it's also excluded to pay daily fares on the rostered day off, which was a bizarre feature of the award in the first place. So that's some good news, and I think that's about the high point of the good news for today's presentation. So we'll just move on to we'll move on to the rest of this award. Rostered days off and time off in lieu. I mentioned at the start or earlier on that the hours of work provisions in the award are extremely inflexible. And I maintain that position. They are quite inflexible. And when you look at the hours of work provision in the award, you'll see that basically the default position is that your ordinary hours will be 38 per week, averaged over 20-day cycle to allow the accrual of an RDO between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. That's the default. Now, most awards, as I say, have a much broader capacity to work, for example, 4 10-hour days instead of 5 8-hour days without the payment of overtime. And as you read through the awards provisions, it's pretty clear that RDOs need to be taken in a fairly rigid manner. They're meant to be fixed by a roster that is not something that gets banked. Now, one of the changes to the award is that they have actually allowed RDO banking. So that's a good thing, that there is actually the capacity to work on RDOs. But what they've done is also made it quite explicit in the award, and it was never quite this explicit, that that if you are required to work on your RDO, then you'll be paid penalty rates for Saturday work, so time and a half for the first 2 hours and double time after that, and you retain the RDO. So in some ways you could argue it's effectively double time and a half or triple time for that work. He then talks about entitlements on termination. Now, clause 33.2 gives some flexibility to work on an other than RDO system. Now, it's not actually that common for civil contractors to work with an RDO system. And so what most people have been doing, and there was an equivalent clause in the old award to this, is he's been working other than an RDO cycle. But what's important is his last sentence. Any such agreement shall be recorded in writing. And that is the key element here. People have been undertaking this practice for a long time, and failing to record it in writing exposes you to a breach of the award, if nothing else. So obviously, you know, the easiest way to do that would be to have a written contract of employment. You probably already have to have one because of the because of that casual clause, at least for those casual employees. You do actually have to engage everyone in writing, just to be clear. It does say at the time of engagement, employer will inform each employee in writing of their terms of engagement, in particular, whether or not they're to be daily hire, etc. So the easiest way to reflect that agreement that's not practicable to work an RDO system is to do that in a written contract. But the point being, it needs to be there and it needs to be in writing, or you're exposed to breaches of the award. Now, the award has also included the time off in lieu of overtime clause. I'm not sure. Sorry, I'll find where that is. So as part of the bigger picture modern award proceedings, there was a test case for time off in lieu of overtime, and that clause has been inserted into the award. It's clause 36.17. But it doesn't apply to daily hire or casual employees, so that doesn't really help. But in any event, it's the model toil provision. And can I just say, from a practical perspective, it's almost unworkable. And I'd be pretty cautious about applying it. So if you ever see the headline that says, toil's now permitted, yes, it is, but read through the process you've got to go through. And in particular, each time you work, or each time you accrue toil, you've got to go through this written agreement process. It's got to be taken within 6 months, et cetera, et cetera. I would suggest to you, if you're looking at putting in place a toil provision, that you would be much better served either putting in place individual flexibility agreements or enterprise agreements to just overcome a whole lot of the machinery provisions here that add a significant amount of red tape without providing any really significant benefit for the red tape other than compliance, and I should say compliance costs. Okay, so that's rostered days off and toil. That's all I want to talk about in terms of the on-site construction award. So if anyone's got any questions about that, perhaps now's the best time to raise them. No, okay, that's all right. I'll move on. So again, there's a huge amount of depth here, and the key takeaway is...
I've got a question. Sorry, yep. I think I was on mute then. Sorry, it's just going back a few steps back to inclement weather. Mm-hmm. And the minimum hours of engagement or payment when it comes to casuals.
Good question.
Yeah, so I know there's a couple of grey areas. That, for example, let's say a casual arrives at a site at 7 a.m. It's raining. They sit them there till, say, 10:30, 11. It's still raining, and then they send them home. I know that the ordinary hours of work for a casual is 4, as far as I understand, under the award, and they shouldn't be penalised. So,
so this actually this is the intersection of two areas of law, and the short answer is that there's no determination on this. I'll just, you've explained the principles, but I'll explain the principles for everyone else's benefit as well. A casual employee, when they're engaged, is engaged to perform a minimum of 4 hours work per occasion, or 4 hours pay per occasion, and that's important when you're talking about weekend work, because it's not 4 hours on a Saturday, it's 4 hours pay on a Saturday, and of course 2 hours at time and a half, and 1 hour at double time ends up at 5 hours pay. But it does say minimum of 4 hours each. On each occasion, they are required to attend work. Okay, and they get the daily fares and travel as well. So the position that you've got is that the casual must get a minimum rate. You talk about casual employment somewhere, and right off the top of my head, somewhere probably in termination, it talks about casual employees getting 1 hour's notice. But in any event, the casual employee gets an hour's notice of termination. So theoretically, you've engaged a casual, you give them, they turn up to work, they get their daily fares for turning up to work, and they get their minimum 4 hour start. And then theoretically, as long as you give them that 1 hour's notice, you could terminate their engagement as at 11 o'clock or whatever, whenever the 4 hours is up, send them home, and that's all they get paid. And that is the practice that generally occurs. Living away from, I beg your pardon, inclement weather doesn't distinguish between casual and non-casual employment. And without sort of going through it in great detail, the gist is you get paid up to 32 hours pay in any 4-week period for each employee. And so the question is, do they get it? And the short answer is we don't know. Arguably, the decision to terminate a casual employee, to terminate their engagement after 4 hours is a form of adverse action, unlawful adverse action, because the reasons you're doing it include their workplace right. But the counter argument to that is that the workplace right is proximate to it. It's got nothing to do with it. The reason you're not engaging them is because you can't give them productive work, and they can't be used. So unfortunately, it's an absolute grey area, and I can't take it any further than that because we don't have any judicial authority to get us beyond that step. And my recommendation for most people who are concerned about that would be do an enterprise agreement, make it clear. Okay, so just a few other, one little bit of housekeeping. The Fair Work wage increase that recently occurred. We normally have pay increases that occur on the 1st of July each year, and this year was different. And just to be mindful, we did have a pay increase in the construction industry because of that decision to do with rationalising the allowances. There will be another increase, and that next increase will be effective from the 1st of November 2020 for the construction awards. There are 3 tranches of awards. The Commission basically said we've got frontline people, they're getting it now. That's mainly the healthcare sectors and education, a few of the others. We've got everybody else in the middle, and then there's the 3rd tranche, which comes online the 1st of February 2021, and that's for the most affected industries, hospitality, tourism, and the like. So just be mindful, there's another increase. I've just picked out construction and clerical, but most civil contractor type awards will be coming into effect from that date as a further increase. Okay, moving from awards and moving into what else is keeping us busy as far as the world of industrial relations goes. It's the term on everyone's lips at the moment. It's this work pack decision. It's a decision to do with casual employment. I'll give you a bit of history just in terms of where this was. There was an earlier work pack decision, work pack and scheme, and that was the one that really started this ball rolling. Now, Mr. Skeen was engaged to work a fly-in, fly-out job. He was rostered 12 months in advance. He knew exactly when he was going to be working, and those hours were identical to the hours that full-time workers would work. And the High Court, or not the High Court, I beg your pardon, it went to the full federal court. The full court said, you're not casual. And the effect of that is that the National Employment Standards, when they talk about annual leave or any of those leave entitlements, they say employees other than casual. So the court didn't determine that they're not a casual. Sorry, the court didn't determine they were full-time. They just said you're not casual. And because of the wording of the legislation is for people other than casuals, they said, well, you're other than casual, you get to double dip. Now, the scheme case was not the ideal vehicle for a High Court challenge because the documentation wasn't great. So what WorkPac did was essentially cop that on the chin and put forward this Rosato case as a case which, in their view, was better documented in terms of the nature of the arrangement and the nature of the engagement. And the court came back with the same answer, even though they had the different documentation. And what it really dealt with was this idea of set-off. You've got a casual loading. The casual loading is payable on account of annual leave, sick leave, personal leave, notice of termination, emergency. And when you do the numbers, you know,
Tom, you've just frozen up, I think. Oh.
set it off. You can't, the employee can double dip. Now I'm getting something saying my internet connection's unstable. So
Yeah,
hopefully...
sorry, Tom. We've just missed about the last 30 seconds of what you just said.
Okay, I was going to say, I just got a note saying my internet connection was unstable. Well, that's true. So what the court said was, well, Mr. Rosato is also other than casual, and they went through the test or how they considered an employee to be casual or other than casual. And it's pretty important to just sort of work through this. It wasn't actually a major change in the law, although it's spoken about that way. What it's really done is brought these things front and centre. In good news, the important part of this decision, which actually slightly waters down the earlier WorkPac decision, is that the determination of whether a person is casual or not should occur at the time the employment is entered into, rather than something that kind of morphs over time. Now, unfortunately, it's not that simple because things can morph over time, and the court was clear about that. But the point being that it's more about what the nature of the relationship is in advance rather than in arrears, because often these things, you know, you employ someone as a casual, they work a few days, and then all of a sudden you're busy and you keep them on, and 2 years later they're still working, and the question was, well, can that lead to liability? And the answer is yes, but from a construction context, I would suggest to you that the application of this decision is not as clear as one might be concerned it is. And the reason for that is that the construction industry is inherently more variable than you get in that mining manufacturing type environment where it's rigid 12 on, 12 off, you know, 2 week on, 2 week off, fly in, fly out, whatever the arrangement is type situation. If you are in that FIFO style situation with rigid shifts, I'd be far more worried about the effect of scheme or Rosato or scheme. The question was then raised by WorkPac, and this is the bit that's likely to form the basis or the major part of the High Court's decision on this, which is this idea of set-off. I mean, I'm paying the casual loading. Why don't I get credit for the casual loading in it? Now, what the court found, there were 5 different engagements for this particular person, and they found that a couple of those engagements did have an effective set-off. So it is possible to have an effective set-off. And in fact, the more extreme contracts that we're drafting, we're suggesting a positive obligation that is the employee repay the money that they got as a casual loading if they are ultimately found not to be casual. So in other words, you don't get both. You don't get your money and your box. You get one or the other. You decide. Now we don't know if that's effective or not, but that's where the pendulum sits at the moment. The government took steps to legislate and put changes into the Fair Work regulations, and the Fair Work regulations say, look, if you're given a casual loading, if it's clearly identified as a casual loading, then that can be set off against any claim in lieu of an entitlement. But the problem from the federal court's perspective was that Mr. Rosato was still an employee of WorkPac. And so his claim wasn't in lieu of an entitlement. His claim was for the actual entitlement. In other words, I want my accrual. So it looks like the Fair Work regulations are only effective if an employee has already left employment. In other words, that's when they get a payment in lieu rather than the entitlement accrued itself. Now, of course, this decision has gone to the High Court, and we have no idea when the High Court's going to hear this, of course. And of course, COVID has probably delayed that again. So I suspect we won't have any real certainty until at least mid next year, by which stage there's the mooted February report date for the federal government's IR roundtables, and that February report date might lead to some of these things being dealt with legislatively anyway. But the key takeouts as far as this is you need to look at your set-off clause. I'd be strongly recommending that you have the casual loading separately identified. Now, most payroll software won't put the casual loading as a separate line item, and that is probably over the top. But at least having a written contract that says, and sorry, I'm good. Sorry, that sign come up again. At least having a written contract that says, your rate of pay is $25. This includes $20 base rate and $5 casual loading. At least makes it clear that's what the intention of that payment is. And that deals with set-off more broadly. We talked about, can you pay above award to factor in allowances? The short answer is you can, but you need to have this thing called a set-off clause. So if you just pay someone an amount of money above the award, and you just assume that's covering it for people's entitlements, it's not. And the law is very clear that it's not something you can just assume. You need to have a specific agreement that allows you to do that. Okay, JobKeeper. I won't go into JobKeeper in great detail. I am mindful of time. But just to be mindful that what I am seeing around our client base is a huge amount of misunderstanding about stand down. Stand down is not something you can just do because the guy next to you is doing it. Stand down is not something you can do, because you feel like it. Stand down is something that requires a specific set of circumstances to exist and to exist within your business. Now, the JobKeeper package has expanded the capacity to stand people down to expressly include coronavirus-related issues or issues that arise from the government's response to coronavirus. But it does not expressly permit stand down to occur simply because of slackness in trade. Now, the starting point of JobKeeper is you've got to be JobKeeper eligible to use the JobKeeper stand down provisions. They don't apply unless you are JobKeeper eligible. If they do apply, note that there is an extremely bureaucratic process that you need to follow. It requires a written notification of the intention to issue a direction, a consultation that has written records of the outcomes, and then ultimately after the consultation, the written direction to be issued. So there is a lot of things to unpack if you're looking to do that. If you're not JobKeeper eligible, and unfortunately the construction industry has not been affected that much, but obviously businesses still are being affected and affected in different ways. You can't simply stand someone down, and I'm seeing it, across the board, not just in the building industry, but across all industries. There's a general belief, probably fueled by the fact that it's being seen in the media, that you can just stand people down now. The risk of stand down is if an employee is ready, willing, and able to work, and they are stood down inappropriately, they are entitled to payment for that period of time. So it's a fairly significant risk that people are taking if they're doing this in the long term. I won't go any further into detail on that other than to say it is strongly recommended that you seek advice in relation to stand downs, whether JobKeeper related or not. Second to last, I believe, issue I'm going to be dealing with is redundancies. I mentioned at the start that there's been a massive spike in unfair dismissal claims. We as a firm, we had about a year's worth of unfair dismissal claims in the month of June. That's how big the spike's been. And I've got an unfair dismissal claim this afternoon for a casual employee who's claiming notice of termination under Rosado and also unfair dismissal. So these are things that are live and they are happening across businesses. So it's important not to get caught. And the thing that is most important to remember is that it's not a simple question of having an operational reason and making a person redundant. There are 3 elements to a genuine redundancy under the Fair Work Act that need to be considered. First one is the genuine operational reason. Now, you will establish that more often than not. You've got a downturn, okay, genuine operational reason. That's reasonably straightforward for people to understand and implement. It's the second two that people get caught up on. The first one is consultation is required as per any applicable award or enterprise agreement. Now, going back to the on-site construction award, clause 8 is the consultation provision, and it talks about what you need to do. Now, this is an area of constant dispute, and it's always the area that's the hardest to follow because it talks about an employer makes a definite decision to make major changes. Sorry, again, I've got the unstable message. But the employer makes a definite decision to make major changes that are going to have a significant effect on the employee. Now, a significant effect, termination is clearly a significant effect. Unfortunately, some judges and many lawyers conflate major changes and significant effects. So in order for consultation to apply, it needs to be both major changes and it needs to have that significant effect. But what's a major change? Now, significant effect is defined. Major change is not defined. And so there's this body of case law. And as I say, some judges think that any significant effect's a major change. That's not the right position, but the question is whether you consult with people and go through the process of consultation just to avoid that argument, even if it's just one person. Now, if it's more than one person, the more people are affected, the more likely it is to be major workplace change. There's no rule about whether it's one person or 20 or any number. Once you get to 15, if you are laying 15 people off, you also need to notify Centrelink. I won't delve into that, but just to flag that for anyone who may find themselves in that position. But the key element that is generally not complied with in consultation, even if some sort of consultation process is undertaken, is this requirement, which is that you need to give a written notice to affected employees about the change. So it's again, more red tape in terms of what you need to do, but make a decision to make someone redundant, you hand over the notice, you then have the consultation. So just a process to follow. And look, the risk averse advice is to follow it in each occasion, then you don't have the argument. But it's a process that unfortunately creates more disputes than it solves often, because people are just wondering why you're even going through this process when it's an obvious redundancy. So some discretion may be used, but as I say, you should seek specific advice in an individual circumstance. And the final one is consideration of redeployment. For small businesses, it's a relatively straightforward process. There is a question mark about whether a person could be redeployed into a JobKeeper position. Don't know yet. That's new law that we're not clear about how that will play out. But for most businesses, the question is, can I put you into another position? Are there available duties, yes or no? It becomes more complicated the bigger your business is, and it also becomes more complicated if your business is part of a group of businesses. And so you need to consider redeployment into any associated entity in addition to your own business. Now, do I have to look interstate? Do I have to look overseas? There is case law that says you probably do. If there are valid redeployment, not valid, if there are available redeployment positions, whether that's a job ad that you're putting out for a completely different position, even if it's a blue collar worker being laid off in a white collar job that you're putting out, if you've got interstate operations, if you've got overseas operations, then it's recommended that you go through that consultation process just so you can deal with all of these redeployment issues at that time rather than taking a chance. rather than taking a chance that someone's going to come back at you. And as I say, with an increasing number of people being laid off, there's increasing numbers of litigation. It's more or less simple maths. And the final thing I'll flag, I won't go into in great detail, is you can't select people unlawfully. You can't select the biggest troublemaker because they're a union member. That would be unlawful. You can't select someone because they've taken heaps of sick days off. They would be all forms of unlawful selection. So you do need to be careful as far as that process goes. And best practice would be that it's sort of almost like thinking about musical chairs. You've got musical chairs. There's one less chair. Group all the people who are in that position. So there might be all the labourers or all the operators or whatever it may be. Rank them based on a set of objective scores, and that gives you something defensible to then say, this is the reason we made our decision. It might be wrong, but as long as it's done in good faith, it shows that you haven't done it for unlawful purposes. Okay. Final thing I'll talk about is portable long service leave. We're currently in a dispute, for want of a better phrase, with the Portable Long Service Leave Board. They had adopted a fairly expansionist approach to portable long service leave, which ought not be the case in our view. Schedule 5 of the Portable Long Service Leave Act was inserted, again by history at my request, to make it clear that changing the definitions in that act when modern awards came in wasn't intended to increase the coverage of the legislation. And so what Schedule 5 says is that basically you take into account awards that applied as at the 31st of December 2009. And if that wasn't an award that was covered, then you shouldn't be covered. So if your business was covered by, and when you read it, it applies to people or businesses that were created after that date, but it says, what was your award? Now, if your award was would have been the old AWU Civil Contracting Award, then the Act ought not apply to you. Unfortunately, that is not the approach that's been taken by the Long Service Leave Board, and no one's run a test case to the Supreme Court to actually work out exactly what it means. But the board takes the view that we come to this definition of buildings or structures. So the way the legislation works is you start off with this predominance rule. So if you work more than half your time performing building work in any 3-month period, and there are slightly different rules for people with shorter periods of employment, but let's just sort of work on that more common case, that you're then covered by the Act. Now, if you stop working on building work as defined for 3 months, and that means no days at all, then you cease to be covered. So you do fall in and out of coverage. But once you meet that predominance rule, any day on a building site is enough to keep you covered, and you've got to have that 3 months stretch completely off before you cease to be covered. Now, the legislation is meant to apply to building work, and it's meant to include civil work, but the definition of civil work is muddied a bit because it talks about a building being, or buildings being buildings or structures. And so the Long Service Leave Board has taken a fairly expansionist view about what is meant by a structure. Now, some things are pretty obviously structures. A bridge is pretty obviously a structure, even though it's classically civil work. But things like pipelines and the like are being considered structures, even though it's not. So I'll flag that this is a live issue, and the mere fact that someone from the Long Service Leave Board comes to tell you that you are in the building industry and therefore required to pay does not go any further than being their opinion, and that CCF is currently engaged in high-level discussions with both the board and the government to make this clear. And so if you do have any issues in this space, rather than thinking you're alone and thinking, geez, I might as well pay it rather than deal with the legal costs and so on, it's worth contacting CCF and joining into that position. If nothing else, your position will be preserved while these issues are dealt with. So you're not alone, and that's what CCF's doing for you. Okay, so that brings me to the final slide that I'll touch on. We've spoken about a lot of different issues. This doesn't help at all for long service leave, but for most of the other issues, there are alternative options in terms of at least assisting to mitigate risk. The three broad options you've got are contracts of employment, individual flexibility agreements, and enterprise agreements. Now, none of these are perfect. There's no right answer that's an absolutely right answer for all circumstances. It's very much a horses for courses approach. But the contract of employment's the least formal, therefore it's usually the most flexible but least powerful mechanism. The other end of the spectrum is the enterprise agreement, and an enterprise agreement effectively becomes your own company's based award. And there's a lot of merit in looking into enterprise agreements if you pay well above award. If you're trying to pay at or very close to the award, an enterprise agreement is just too difficult to be made, because you'll see somewhere the better off overall test. So I've got to look behind that screen, but the better off overall test means that we've got to turn up to the commission and establish that everyone is better off under this agreement than under the award. And because awards are so complicated, unless you're completely replicating the award, which would defeat the purpose of trying to come up with streamlined conditions, then you'll find that that it becomes difficult. But if you are well above award, there's a lot of merit in looking to streamline your conditions and come up with something that works for your business. And the halfway house between those two positions are these things called individual flexibility agreements. So each award has a provision in it of this sort of nature, and it talks about an individual flexibility agreement. And it's a special type of, it's sort of like a special type of contract, for want of a better expression. But the point of an individual flexibility agreement is that non-monetary benefits can be taken into account. We don't know the nature and extent of that yet. It's still very much an untested area, but you have far more power to include or set off than you would under merely a contract of employment. Because at the end of the day, the contract of employment, all you can do is protect yourself in terms of the set-off clause, in terms of being able to apply overpayments to underpayments, and you know, ultimately end up in a position where you're as best as you can be, but it still operates subject to that award safety net. So if the sum total of the award is greater than the sum total of the contract, there is an underpayment there. Whereas with an IFA, if there was some non-monetary benefit to it, then you might be okay. And an example of that, they are fairly nuanced, but some examples of that would be, I often, well, not often, but when I do IFAs, you might have a clerk working part-time, wants some flexible hours. The award's really difficult to deal with part-time hours. You know, if they're a young mother and they want to have some flexibility to go and attend school things or whatever it may be, the award doesn't really allow that, but an individual flexibility agreement can. Again, properly drafted. You know, similarly, you might not get any credit if you give someone a vehicle they can use on the weekend. You don't necessarily get credit under a contract of employment for that, but you can get credit for that through the IFA mechanism. And there's a lot more than that, but obviously in this sort of forum, there's too many variables to talk through. You really need to get specific advice about what you're trying to do and what that might mean if you want to go down that path. Okay, so we now move to the most important slide for every lawyer's presentation, which is the disclaimer. But I would just flag that the bottom line too, which is CCF retains our firm to provide various pieces of advice and do various bits and pieces. But one of them is that members do get a half hour of free advice. So if there is anything that you have heard today that you want to explore more in terms of your own circumstances, noting the disclaimer being this is very much a general presentation, there's a half hour free there too, so you can follow that up without the clock being on. So look, that's the end of my presentation. If anyone's got any questions, more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you very much everyone for your attendance.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Has anyone got any questions at all? No? Okay. So, yeah, thank you again for taking the time today.
Sorry, Melissa, it's Julie Hill here.
Julie's got one.
I was just trying to find my unmute button there. It's a bit slow on it.
No,
I'm
all
just seeking a little clarification around when, Tom, you were talking about under clause 17 of the modern award. Am I correct in understanding that if a person's employment terminates for any other reason than you know, a dismissal for what's the term?
Misconduct or refusal of duty is the
misconduct is what I'm looking for. Yeah. So for any other reason, if they leave or their employment is terminated, then the redundancy pay applies. Is that correct?
Correct. So resignations and redundancy. So look, I mean, I won't go into depth of the history of this. It was pretty murky industrial history arising out of the 80s that led to this occurring. And then it started in the building sector and sort of filtered its way out through to the other sectors in the industry. But this is all part of those industry redundancy schemes, which certain industrial parties, not CCF, but certain industrial parties benefit from. And so the idea was, we'll just put this definition in, everyone pay into this fund, you know, we'll scoop the cream off the fund, and you know, you don't have to worry about it when you're paying to that fund. And that's essentially what it is, which is, you know, again, it's murky industrial history from the 80s, but everyone's lumped with the outcome of that being that yes, if someone resigns, technically under this award, they're redundant. Now, an enterprise agreement can override this. So you'll see here that that what it says in 17.1 is that because of the effect of section 123(4)(b) of the Act, the National Employment Standards redundancy provisions don't apply. So you don't get both, you get one or the other. Now, if someone's genuinely redundant under the National Employment Standards, there might be a higher amount of pay. It goes up to 16 weeks depending on service. But certainly in the first few years, both the rate of payment is and the circumstances in which you get that payment are much higher under this award. So you can do an enterprise agreement to remove that entitlement, but in round numbers, to buy it out, you're talking about buying out 1.75 hours pay. So you're talking about, again, round numbers, it depends what your classification is, but about $1 an hour on top of the base rate of pay in an enterprise agreement just to buy out that entitlement. And then you would still face traditional redundancy in the context of a traditional redundancy.
Thank you for that explanation.
Anyone else?
Could I ask a question?
Of course you can.
Sorry. My question is, what do we do? Like, they've got new rules about casual employment and having to offer. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
We can. Yep.
Okay. They've got rules about saying you have to offer a casual employee a permanent position after 6 months of employment. Is there a way to sort of work around that? Because like we're kind of in a position where sometimes we've got a lot of work and then we don't. It just depends on what jobs we've got coming up. And how do you sort of justify getting around making them permanent when like we may not have work to offer them?
Yeah, so there's a few ways you can do it. Again, nothing's ever perfect. First one is you can do an enterprise agreement that gets rid of casual conversion. All this comes into the better off overall test, so you kind of get rid of it. But you know, if you're paying above award, you can do that. The second one is rather than engaging casuals, why not engage daily hires? Because that way you just deal with that. Like, interestingly, if you're working any amount of overtime, casual employment starts to become quite expensive relative to full-time employment. And that's because you're paying the 25% loading and you're also paying that on overtime hours. whereas you don't pay that for full-time employees, and you're not incorporating that into any on cost in terms of annual leave and the like, because they're all paid back at base rate of pay. And so especially for that first 2 hours of overtime each day, it's generally more expensive and quite a lot more expensive to engage casual. So, second option is daily hire. You would then have to pay the redundancy at the end. So going back to that redundancy definition, you see that if someone, like, the scale starts at 1 year, but if it's less than 12 months and they say it's redundancy occasioned otherwise than by the employee. So that's if you lay someone off for any reason, but you laying them off. In other words, if not otherwise than by the employee. So you still have to sort of somewhere clock up the 1.75 hours pay for that purpose. But then you're in a position where you can just finish them up reasonably quickly, and yes, you've got to put them out, terminate them, all those kind of things. But you don't then have that rigidity of a period of notice that can become quite significant. And the third way, which is the way people normally do it, but is the riskiest because it's not certain, is that you are entitled to refuse a request for casual conversion. There's not an absolute right to convert. The actual requirement is somewhere. Sorry, I'm just trying to find somewhere. Anyway, without reading it for everyone, the requirement is that the employer needs to genuinely consider it and can't refuse it unless it's on reasonable business grounds. So if you're looking ahead, then and it looks like the demand's going to drop off, then that's a reasonable basis to do it. But it's messy when you're in that space because you're using the word reasonable. I think it appears about twice or three times, and every time reasonable appears in anything legal, you know that lawyers can have a good argument about it too.
Is it possible to convert someone from being a casual employee to being a daily hire, or that's something that they'd have to be from the very beginning?
It's an interesting feature of this clause that it clearly refers to full-time or part-time employment. And full-time and part-time employment, as you can see, full-time and part-time, they're both different types of employment. They're not daily hire. So my reading of this clause is that this is a classic example of where a test case just gets lumped into a document that doesn't necessarily have regard to the nature of it. But there's no reason why you can't offer daily hire employment as an alternative to them. And in terms of you saying to them, hey, look, I've reasonably considered this, that will bolster that argument. But there's no guarantees that's fully acceptable or what it is. It's just, as with most IR stuff, you kind of have to operate in a field of grey, and there is no certainty in this answer. But if you offer them daily hire employment, it's much more difficult for an employer to complain that you didn't reasonably consider their position.
Anyone else? No? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'll upload the recording of this webinar to our website and email it through shortly, along with the schedule of rates that Tom provided us earlier, end of June, beginning of July as well. And by all means, if you've got any questions, you can refer them to me or Tom as well. I'll put Tom details on the email. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.